And while advocacy has become a vital part of the conference, some 12 years ago, 7 years ago, it was officially became an active arm of the conference. Dr. Avon Hart-Johnson, despite an already extremely busy schedule, which we kind of talked about yesterday, as a university educator, founder, and the president of DC Connects, which offers support for women returning from prison, generously, among numerous other professional responsibility, volunteered to assume the role as chair of the Conference Advocacy and Action Coalition. With a strong organizational and leadership skills, the Advocacy and Action Task Force, or Coalition, has actively addressed a number of critical advocacy issues and created effective, tangible resources for strengthening and validating the self-advocacy efforts for prison family members. Avon and several members of the coalition will be sharing with us today a critical focus of the active advocacy that's coming this year and a sneak peek at the amazing masterclass series that they've been working on. So with that said, I would like to turn over the mic to Dr. Avon Hart-Johnson.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Kayla, for that introduction. And first of all, let me just pause for a second before I give any remarks about the Advocacy and Action Coalition and just say thank you, Kayla, for sharing your journey, your experience, and all that you have done for your mom, all that you have juggled and kept, planning and organizing and keeping all of this afloat. I mean, everybody, can we just give her an air clap for all the work that she has done? It is quite amazing.
Hello.
Amazing. The other thing that I want to say before we begin is that let each of us hold Carolyn and our high thoughts, our prayers, and offer good vibes. This is her baby. This is her conference. So as we move forward with today, tomorrow, and Friday, let us just keep focusing on Carolyn and keeping her in our warm thoughts and prayers. So let me officially say good morning. Good morning to you on the East Coast of the United States, on the West Coast of the United States, in the United Kingdom, and from the various time zones across the nation. We are so glad that you are here. I am Dr. Avon Hart-Johnson, the chair of the Advocacy and Action Coalition. Today, we have several members of the Advocacy and Action Coalition working group with us and the close supporters who worked alongside with us, donating their expertise and their support during the whole time that we worked on the 2022 initiatives. Before I introduce the Advocacy and Action Coalition Working Group, I want to first acknowledge my co-presenters today. Dr. Monique Tate is here with us, and she'll be helping out, taking us through an interactive exercise. I see her there. We have Tiffany Green, who will lead us through an interactive exercise and speak about the grounding within the philosophy of advocacy. And then we also have Jess Angel, who will be monitoring the chat. She is coming to us from Alaska at an ungodly time of the morning. So God bless her for being here this morning. She's here to help us out. So again, it is my honor to welcome you each to the 2022 International Prisoner Family Conference. This is an exciting time. I want to extend my heartfelt appreciation to Carolyn Esparza, the chair of the International Prisoner Family Conference, as well as a member of the Advocacy and Action Coalition. Carolyn was there with us during our working group meetings and, showing support. And for those of you who know Carolyn, we have an affectionate name. We call her Mama Carolyn because truly she's like a second mother to us who are involved in the conference, planning, organizing, or whatever. So those of you who are familiar with that, you kind of get the inside joke. Carolyn keeps us in line. Carolyn appointed me as chair of the Advocacy and Action Coalition in 2013. It was almost a decade ago, and I'll tell you, time really flies. I am really happy that the Advocacy and Action Coalition is the first session of the conference. The focus on advocacy sets the stage for illuminating strength-based perspectives. It also gives us a platform to examine some of the tough issues that we may not really want to talk about, but yet it establishes the grounding for a vision towards hope that we can do something about the problems that we see. So today we're going to tackle some of those issues and highlight it, but I am hopeful that the advocacy work can and will be what saves the world from itself. And I truly mean that. Hope is the foundation of our advocacy work, and it's what steers our goals and directs our path towards ensuring the well-being of others and helping to illuminate such tough and difficult work rather than to chase shiny objects that may take us off path. Instead, we remain steadfast and we believe at collectively chipping away at the problem. So what are we going to focus on today? All right, so today we're going to focus on the masterclass series, and Dr. Tate will further elaborate on that. We'll share the importance of self-care and mental health focus. We'll extend a call to action, hoping that some of you may want to join the Advocacy and Action Coalition. Today, I want to acknowledge the Advocacy and Action Working Group team. Now, although the membership for Advocacy and Action may extend to about 100 or 150 people, we have a small working group who actually come together and work on issues. And this year, Carolyn joined us as the Advocacy and Action member. We have Allegra Pasinki as a member, Dr. Amanda Lewis, Dr. Monique Tate, Tiffany Green, Julie Uribe, Jim Prager, Vetta Dunstan, Miss Rita Dixon, and Jess Angel. We also have supporters, Julia from Prisoner Family Alliance. We have Dr. Jeff Johnson from DC Project Connect and Noah Austin from Students for a Just Society. So what is Advocacy and Action all about? Well, the mission of the Advocacy and Action Coalition is to promote social justice by advancing the rights of families of the incarcerated through systemic advocacy and community education, supporting healthier families and communities. Now, the thing that you'll notice is that all the work that we do is basically centered around those prongs. So, having said that, let us share a little bit about our advocacy philosophies. And to do so, I will introduce Tiffany Green.
Okay. Hello, I'm Tiffany Green. So I wanted to ask a question, and thank you, Dr. Avon, for that introduction. I did want to ask a question and invite you to put in the chat box your initial thoughts about the answer. And the question I have for you is, what does advocacy mean to you? And Jess Angel will help me monitor the chat and so we can pick out a few responses to discuss here in the time we have. So Kim Dearman, thank you, says working together to better yourself and others. Julia says helping others and providing support to those that are unable to provide that support to themselves, I'm assuming. Being a voice, giving a voice to those who have no voice. Good. So making a difference. Excellent, excellent. Education. I love that education piece. Very good. So we'll go ahead and thank you for your answers. You can continue to type out those answers. We'll revisit as we have a minute here, but I did want to share some of the points that we think about when we talk about advocacy. First of all, we're looking at an important issue, and usually it's important because it affects a large amount of people, and it impacts many who, as it was mentioned, don't have a voice and need that help. It impacts a large group of diverse people with different experiences and perspectives. So we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. And while we do that, I'll take a look again at the chat here. Engage, educate, and empower. Very good. And that was Maura. Bonnie says, when necessary, holding the powers that be accountable to policy and rights of our loved ones and family members. Excellent. So holding people accountable, I think, is awesome. A very valid point. So advocacy is more than single-handedly trying to change the world. A lot of times people, I feel, think that, well, I have to do something great and amazing in order to be an advocate. But really, it starts on a personal level, where you make meaning of your experience. You recognize the trauma that you or a loved one has been through, and you reclaim that power. And as you are able to make that meaning and use your voice individually, maybe it's just on a small level with people you know or people you're comfortable with, then it can spread to more of a larger level, a team level. So we'll go ahead and move the slide. So the Advocacy in Action Coalition is that an example of that team level of advocacy. And there's examples of this level of advocacy in many, many places, but our big takeaways, the points that we really want to emphasize are listed here, but looking at what are other people's experiences and how can we highlight those in the form of story, but also simply giving power to these people and sharing their courage and inspiring others. Respecting the whole person. So recognizing that each individual has the capacity for mental, social, emotional, intellectual, and personal achievements. And so as a team, we are able to do all these things. And I think we're all at a different level of advocacy, and all of those paths are truly honorable. You may be at the stage of quietly acknowledging that something has happened to you and that you want to make it turn for good, for the good of others, even just yourself or your family. Or you could be at the level of running an advocacy organization. I think if we all pick up our corner of an issue and lift it, then together we can really inspire dialogue, we can inspire listening to others, and we can inspire hope. So with that, I would love to turn the time over to Dr. Avon again to introduce our masterclass series. And thank you for your comments and for listening.
Excellent, excellent. Thank you, Tiffany, for giving us that overview of the advocacy perspectives that basically help to frame our work and drive our purpose. So I think it's important that you indicated that there's a level of personal responsibility as well as collective responsibility, because when we come together as a team, that is when we show to each other and demonstrate to each other that we're committed to the work. All right, so each year after we leave the conference, the Advocacy and Action Coalition Working Group comes together and we try to figure out what are going to be the priorities. How can we come up with a set of actionable steps? How can we come up with some deliverables that we'll be able to deliver to the upcoming year's conference that is both meaningful but helpful to families impacted by incarceration and even for advocates and those who are working in the space of social justice. So when we brainstormed the 2022 initiatives, we asked ourselves, how do we tap into the wisdom of people who have done this before? How do we tap into the knowledge of seasoned speakers, but yet make it conversational and be meaningful to the users? How can we come up with a set of deliverables that get into the real issues, yet engender hope amid a world filled with cynicism sometimes, and share common sense approaches to the work? So our answer is the 2022 Masterclass series. Now, the thing that I want to mention is that we looked at some top issues, of which the first one is death in custody. Yes, it is a challenging and it's a big issue and it's a serious issue, but we decided that we weren't going to walk away from that topic because there are people who are literally dealing with this. Some of the advocacy groups on here have dealt with this and responded by way of support group, including PFA that I see here on the screen, the work that Barbara does, the work that Julia does. So I'm very grateful that we enter into this space of work as a collective, calling upon each other, referring to each other in terms of subject matter expertise, support, and services. So thank you for that. So the first area that we looked at is death in custody. The second one we looked at is trauma in prison. The third, we wanted to look at the well-being of the advocates and the family members with a specific focus on self-care and mental health, collaborating with those inside and outside of the prisons. And also, how do we advance that transformative level of structural change by way of legislation, by way of policy? How do we make that happen? And so, having said that, we introduced and invited a number of speakers. We introduced the speakers to our work. We invited them to come in and share their work by way of video interviews. So the first speaker that addressed the issue of death in custody is shown here, Heidi Sernaka. She is a civil rights attorney. She's best known for the work that she's done in Kenyan prisons, where in Kenya, they don't have public defenders. So the women within the Kenyan prisons trained and became paralegals to fight on their own behalf. That, my friends, is self-advocacy and self-determination. So Heidi is going to be presented a little bit later on by Dr. Tate, and she'll walk us through some of the big takeaways from that particular series of videos. The next individual we interviewed is Donna Hilton. Donna focused on trauma that occurs within the prison systems, but she brings a unique perspective because Donna herself suffered personal trauma as she was a victim of human trafficking, but then re-traumatized once she went to prison. So she comes back to us in the community as a person who has firsthand testimony explaining what she went through. And she enlightens us through her nonprofit organization, A Little Piece of Light. The next individual is a friend, a colleague, and also he serves on the International Coalition for Children with Incarcerated Parents, Luciano Cadoni. He focuses on, in his series of videos, the well-being of children, and he reminds us to create a safe space for children and simply ask them before you get into any advocacy work, how are you doing? How are you feeling? And then actively listening. So I'm excited about Luciano's video series for a number of reasons, but mainly because we produce this series in English and in Spanish. And I want to acknowledge Tiffany Green, who served as our translator, did a fantastic job. It was absolutely wonderful to see that work unfold, and I'm really proud of that video series. And by the way, let me indicate that all of these resources, including this presentation, will be made available. There are hyperlinks in this presentation that you can use and go to the available resources and go to the videos as well. Just Angel will be dropping some links that are helpful in the chat a little bit later on. So I just wanted to share that. Some of you know Charlie Sullivan. Charlie Sullivan is known for his work on Capitol Hill. He's known for his advocacy work with National Cure and also the advocacy work in the DC area. Charlie reminds us that we need to take our own stance and personal power and to progress towards legislative change, to make change, and to recognize that sometimes we gotta have a conversation with people who don't think like us and have different ideologies. So Charlie is a talker, and he engages in a really good conversation around advocacy and working with legislators and others. John Clark is a former prison warden. He comes to us from a perspective of how do you sit down and have a conversation with someone on the inside of the prisons? How do you deal with and how do you forge a connection with prison administrators? Awesome series when it comes to the conversation with John Clark. And then finally, we have Amani Webb-Smith. She is a lawyer, and she has been involved in various legislative and policy efforts in New York City. And she talks about advocacy from the perspective and the lens of an attorney. But when you really get down to it, she reminds us, somebody's done this work before. Seek out those organizations that might align with your initiatives towards advocacy, towards looking out for your family members, towards making sure that you can identify those quick wins and at least move towards a step-by-step incremental set of changes towards the well-being of those who are incarcerated, towards the well-being of yourself. And so she brings that policy perspective. And so what I'd like to do before I turn it over to Dr. Tate, I'd like to tell you that the video series that you will see and hear about was produced by Noah Austin. Now, I don't know if Noah is with us right now, but he is from American University. He worked with DC Project Connect, somewhat of an intern relationship. He actually produced those videos for the Advocacy and Action Coalition. So it's this partnership between, DC Project Connect and the Advocacy and Action Coalition. So I really want to give a special shout out to Noah. Thank you for all the work that you do. This work will continue into 2023 as we continue to work on parsing out and placing up on our YouTube channel all of this information and resources for you all. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce a chartered member of the Advocacy and Action Coalition who has been with us since the beginning, Dr. Monique Tate. Dr. Tate, I turn it over to you.
All right, Halito Osio, welcome and greetings to all who are with us today. And thank you for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Avon. And thank you to our team and to Carolyn and to everyone who's here. We had a really a wonderful year this year, working toward enriching our advocacy output and outreach by tapping into the experiential knowledge of leading voices in the field of advocating in this field for their strength and their knowledge for the work that they do on the ground at the grassroots level, because that's where advocacy starts, at the grassroots level, right? With our own experiences and our empathy for others who are experiencing the same thing. So we had the pleasure of having wonderful voices that Dr. Avon has presented to you, and we participated in those interviews, and just hearing the level of their passion and their empathy for others, it is what drives what we do. And it's encouraging to know that there are people out here across the country and across the world that are interested in maintaining this voice and never letting the voice of advocacy die down to the point where we're not heard, but we're keeping that voice regenerative. We're keeping it moving, because this mass incarceration maintains a very critical issue in the United States, because the United States remains the #1 incarcerator on the planet. So with that comes a lot of the things that we've been talking about here, the effect that that has, not only to the person who's enduring the incarceration, but also to the families, to extended families, to children, and people who care about this issue in our country. So talking about the Master Series, the resources, to have this as a resource, so that how do we make advocacy tangible and doable and reachable for those who have the compassion but may not know where to start or how to start if they find themselves in the predicament of having to advocate on behalf of someone whose voice is not heard. So we wanted to create engaging content with applicability and utility. So the philosophy that drove the project was to create engaging video content for our users that was conversational and had application and utility. In other words, it's just keeping it real, right? No fudging, just what are the issues? How do we really feel about that? And taking on the tough issues that are, not always the easiest thing to talk about, because it brings a lot of emotional stress. I'm looking forward to our next presenter, who's going to talk about, how do we keep ourselves healthy mentally and dealing with our stressors when it comes to advocating in this particular way. So the philosophy that when we started this project, we asked ourselves, so what are the key values that we need to focus on when we're creating fact sheets? What insights and information do we need to bring into focus, and why? In other words, again, how do we make it tangible, doable, and reachable? And how do we reach the heart of people? Because when you say that mass incarceration is a human rights issue, that's what we're talking about, right? We're talking about humanity, even at this level. Humanity needs to be across the board in every action in our lives, no matter what we have to deal with in life, including dealing with mass incarceration. Humanity still needs to prevail, right? But how do we bring that across and make it reachable to those to those who may not quite understand why do we need humanity when we're dealing with the prison system? But there are real concrete reasons why we need to do that. If we are a democratic society, if we are a society of heart, a society of passion, we need to be able to instill those that ideology in all the ways that we deal with each other, as a social society. So this drove our mission and selection of individuals that for the interviews that you saw that Dr. Avon presented. And what you will hear next is a snippet of some of the outcomes of this year's masterclass, the video shorts and fact sheets. And I do want to just to remind the audience that the content for the discussion that you were about to hear, it might be overwhelming. So if you do need to step away or just need to practice some self-care, we just wanted to make sure that you were aware of that. So Dr. Avon, if you want to go to the next slide.
Okay, are you ready for me to cue it up?
Yes, I'm ready for you to cue it up.
And I would ask the audience that if you have to adjust your screen so that you can see a little bit more real estate in terms of seeing the video, please do so now. I'm going to silence myself and cue up the video.
And while Dr. Avon is queuing that up, there's two discussion questions that we would love to engage you all, is to focus on what story do you hear? And what approaches do you think are manageable if you were in this position and had to deal with this specific issue?
I think that Dr. Tate may interweave into her question the mass incarceration continuum. As we focused back in 2015, or I believe 2016, on this idea that mass incarceration is a continuum with feeder systems that feed into this perpetual, incarceration and recidivism cycle. And so she may, touch on that as she goes into her questions. I want to read you something, and then I'm going to ask you to provide us with a response. And I'm going to set this up by saying the United Nations principles on human rights are the host of conditions that have to do with treatment, humane treatment of the residents of the prisons, but also their families, how you treat individuals, how you use punishment such as segregation and denial of liberties. And we know that prison in itself is denial of liberties. But I want to read you something and then ask you, as a human rights advocate and someone who is understanding of the Mandela Rules, how would you respond as an advocate to this? The letter reads, "My brother recently passed away while serving a 7-year sentence. He was moved to a medical facility and my family wasn't contacted or given any information regarding his condition. I called the facility several times and was told that I was not on his visitor list. I tried to find out if he was able or in a state to even call or to put anyone on his list and got no response. I finally emailed the chaplain at the prison, and he called me days later to inform me of my brother's death the previous day. In addition to my family, he has siblings and children. He also has a host of grandchildren who are numb and devastated, knowing that their loved one has passed away and feeling unloved. Is there anything that we can do as advocates?" And I know that's a horrible, horrible story. But when we look at this human rights perspective, and then here we are as advocates trying to get a foothold, using grassroots initiatives and trying to find our way into policy and legislation to make a difference, what is it that you can advise us as advocates that we should be focused on?
A couple of things that I thought of. First, I just want to say, that is such a horrible story that should never happen. And I have no doubt it's not unique to her. I don't think it happens all the time, but I don't think it's unique. When I thought about how would I advocate with that, a couple things I thought of, one, I would want to try to get the records of what happened with his health. How long was he sick?
Mm-hmm.
So get somebody that could work with, if it was me, get somebody that could work with me through a Freedom of Information Act to ask for my family members' medical records, because we who work in this field know that prison specific medical facilities are not common. So when you move someone there, it's not because they got a splinter, right? So we know that something was serious in his case. And I get that sometimes people don't want to talk to their family. And so the prison system is trying to respect that somebody might not want to talk to a family member. But when you're in a situation like that, and there's clearly a chaplain there, why wouldn't the chaplain have gone to him and said, is there someone we can contact? Your family's calling me. Can I put them in contact with you? And if he says no, he says no, right? But so for that family, those are some things I think of, but I think the impact of that is at the grassroots, your organizations working with CURE to say, who else has been through this? How do we collect these stories? How do we collect these stories and put them on a map so people can start seeing that this wasn't a one-off,
Yes.
How do we go to, because then you have multiple single impact statements, right? Not just one. And I thought I mean, you asked how I would advocate. Some of the things I would do is maybe make that story, talk about somebody being in a hospital, the family member not having access to them, make it a very moving story. And then at the very end say, and by the way, it was a prison hospital. You know, so you make it a super sympathetic story. And then in the end say that hospital happened to have bars on the windows.
Excellent.
Because then you, yeah, so you pull people in. The Mandela Rules, I was looking at them regarding this specific issue, and I thought, you know, the Mandela Rules say detained people as possible should be as close to their families, should be close to their families. It sounds like she didn't even know where he was, much less was he close to her family, his family, you know. It says he specifically has the right to inform his family of his serious illness. Sounds like she was informed, but again, that facility, if they're a hospital facility, they should have the resources, the caseworkers, and the people that know how to follow up with families of their patients. The Mandela Rules, unfortunately, are like, they're guidelines. So they don't have what we say, they don't have teeth in court. You can't sue the government because it didn't fulfill the Mandela Rules, but you can shame the government because it didn't fulfill the Mandela Rules.
First of all, thank you, Heidi, for an insightful answer. I think that framing the story in a manner that taps into individuals' humanity and then say, by the way, this was a prison hospital or a prison medical ward. So thank you for that. I think that's wonderful. And I think you've also given us some ideas in terms of how to put together a set of resources and fact sheets that's related to that issue.
Wow. No matter how many times I've viewed that and heard that, it still affects me to just, you know, quite deeply. But I would like to open up to the audience for some engagement, to think back to what you just heard. What story did you hear? What touched you? If you would like to type your answers into the chat, or if anyone would like to join in, you know, making a verbal statement, you can do that as well. And the other part of that is, what approaches do you think would be manageable for you if you were in that situation? What were some of the takeaways from our expert advocate to address an issue like that? So, did anyone want to share? What story did they hear?
Oh,
Kate, we do have some in the chat.
Okay, I'm trying to check it now.
is mine on there? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. And of course, it's just immediately, because I have a legal background, I thought to myself, did they do everything right when they went in that? First, that looks like, can you still hear me?
We can hear you now. We lost you for a moment.
All right. But anyway, because it's so important, those pre-trial interviews, in the federal system, I'm not so sure on state, but I know that they follow. You did not tell them in the pregnancy report that you lived with your grandmother raised.
I think you're going in and out. I can read from the chat. I believe you said you would have to make sure in the federal system that they are in your pre-trial interview or they can't get on the list. Okay. It starts before someone goes into prison, and then if they are in, you have to get them to amend it if they didn't do it. Okay. And I think I see a couple more. Let's see if I can grab that. Trying to see it here.
Would you like me to read them for you?
Oh, sure. Can you do that? I'm trying to scroll.
Yes. Yeah, no, of course,
Yeah.
of course. Julia said, thank you for the information. And she wishes that she had this information when her brother had passed in prison. So it's very important to share this information. It looks like in Texas prison support groups We constantly remind families to get the HIPAA release from their loved one early in incarceration and to monitor the renewal dates. And it looks like there was another one about, making sure to get the HIPAA and to contact your senator to help with visits and DOC issues. And pre-sentencing, not trial, is what Kim said. So it wasn't the pre-trial interview, it was a pre-sentencing interview, she said.
Okay. Okay. So what approaches did you think that would be that are something tangible that you can do? We talked about the HIPAA, but there were some other suggestions that were made during the video as well. Seeing if there's others that are out there. It's always good to connect with people. The United States is being the number one incarcerated. There are millions of families of all walks of life, all social backgrounds that are affected by mass incarceration. And you would be hard pressed not to find someone who is. So reaching out to local, I can suggest by starting with looking for local agencies, and connecting with this conference as well. There's a plethora of experts in this conference that do work. Not only we do it, work collectively, but each of us also work individually within our own states and areas within the field of advocacy that we're in. Like I do human rights advocacy across the United States, and I see all type of cases, but connecting with other groups in different states and other advocacy groups has helped when the stories are similar. Like, in other words, we're kind of building up our story base to make this issue more humanistic. Anyone else want to share any other approaches that they felt was manageable? Getting documentation was something, right, in the visits. Now, the issue with visits now, I don't know if we're working with the case that's in Virginia, and if you're not getting the COVID shot, you're not getting a visit. People are being, they're isolated. Like if they're being moved from one prison to another, they're being isolated for a certain amount of time. So now the COVID is factoring in with that part and having contact with your loved ones as well. And someone said, I think if someone has a loved one on the inside right now, start communicating with them. Yes, you can do that. And one of the things that we do, we also reach out to the social worker. We do well care checks on family members that we have or people in our nation that are incarcerated. We will do well care checks and we check in. Calling does make a difference. It does, because if they know that someone cares, they know that someone's watching and observing. This is how violations happen, right? Things just happen. Prisons are their own community, right? We would never know what really goes on in there because we're not there, right? But a way in is to make contact with the facility and to be consistent with that. It does help and it does make a difference. And also reaching out to your state senators, your congressmen and women, that is also effective. We do that a lot within the advocacy work that we all do. And that is effective because if you don't say anything, it's as if it's not an issue. But if you are saying something, it is. And that is something that's manageable and that's doable. Just picking up the phone and making contact. So is there anything else that, establishing those good lines of communication, and there should be more community involvement in our prison, but that's why we're together as an advocacy group so that we can bring the empathy part and the humanity part. Like I said, whatever part of a walk of social life that we have, we want to instill humanity, right? We're the number one democratic country in the world, and we should be the leaders of humanity. And that includes when we're dealing with families and people who are interfaced with the criminal justice system. And we know that there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to correct egregious violations of human rights and that within our system. Because like we said, it does not just affect those who are incarcerated, it affects the families, it affects the children, it affects grandparents, it affects, those of us in the community who are, impacted by that. So,
Dr. Tate, I want to read what Kel wrote in the chat. She
yes.
said, I had the reverse happen 2 weeks ago. My loved one's mom was on life support and dying. I called the prison and asked them to get him out of his cell and bring him to the phone so he could say goodbye with his family. It was 11 p.m. They said no. The system actively works to separate families. It was heartbreaking.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, what would it have been to just let him get on the phone? Like, where is he going to go? Like, why would that be a problem? But this is what we face. This is what we face across the country. And it takes the work of groups like ourselves and our individual, and never second guess your own individual impact. It does matter what each person does. And it matters that each individuals are coming together in a more collective way to say that, hey, as people who live in this country, we are concerned about this issue because we should have humanity and dignity at every level of social life within our society. And I'm very sorry that happened. And unfortunately, it does happen. We're going through a situation right now as well, where we have one of our family members and they're, have been moved to a different prison, and we have not managed to be able to get through. Like, they don't want to answer the phone, or they don't want to, they don't want to give you information. So we're going to have to find some, we're going to get in, because we don't take no for an answer. And that's another thing I can advise you as well. Don't take no for an answer. This is your loved one. This is the person that's part of your family. Don't take no for an answer. Don't, just because they hang up, well, we'll call again. If they don't respond right away, then I'm going to find someone above that person that can answer. So, and thank you, Jess, so much for reading those. Prisons use short staffing as an excuse for many things, but it's true that an area without enough, I'm trying to see if I can see that. Oh, officers to safely oversee a trip to the phone will not be able to honor a last minute request like the one described. Right. And we understand there are barriers. We understand that. But I think the idea is that it's just the overall philosophy of humanity in following the human rights protocols that we should. So there are some things going on within the United States. The United States sent a delegate to CERD, that's the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, in August. The UN did give the United States a little handshake that they don't have for not having a federal coordination for a human rights mechanism. So there are some things that we've been involved with, trying to get contact with the State Department to make us more compliant with international human rights principles, which, we're supposed to already do that, right? On face value, the U.S. is looked at as that to be the forerunner of human rights. But unfortunately, we know in the background, in the work that we do as advocates, that is not always the case, because we have the real stories. So real stories are important, right? That's what humanizes the issue. That's what makes the issue real. We're not just talking about numbers, right? Statistics. We're talking about real families, real people, real issues that are documented. So I guess I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Avon Hart-Johnson, and thank you so much for allowing me to share for our master series.
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Tate, for leading us through that important discussion. And also, I want to thank those of you who contributed to the chat. Let me extend and acknowledge the lady whose mom was on life support. It makes issues like this important for us to raise the awareness, to remind people that you're not alone, and here's the thing that I suggest, that for our 2023 initiative, that we come together as a collective to try our best to influence those last phone calls.
Yes.
Whether it's video, online, we need to come together and come up with a strategy and mobilize advocacy groups and nonprofit groups across the nation to focus on that particular initiative as we work in parallel to some of those other advocacy initiatives that are underway. So having said that, let me jump back on target and on script and acknowledge that we have Jess Angel, who will be coming to us explaining the use of the fact sheets and the importance of a focus on mental health. So Jess, take it away.
Thank you. Can you go to the next slide, please, for me? So I know Heidi talked a little bit about the human rights violations and death in custody and what we can do, right? And I'll just kind of recap that. Get documentation, utilize FOIA, which is the Freedom of Information Act, pair up with grassroots organizations. And, you know, I'll drop a link in the chat here in a moment for a great, you know, I guess it's like a video with Dr. Robert Mitchell. It's phenomenal. You have to watch it. And he also has a great organization, is knowingyourrightscamp.com. And, you know, just stay educated, inform yourself. Information is power. I always tell everybody, knowledge is power. Knowledge is where you need to go. And also, you know, reaching out to a pro bono attorney or organizations like ACLU, and even doing Google search. You can find so much that's out there. And really staying, you know, when you're dealing with these kind of things, I always tell people that, you know, you can't support someone else unless you're supporting yourself. So taking care of your mental health and well-being is very, very important. You know, it's okay to seek out, you know, formal support by, you know, going to a therapist or, you know, doing some kind of grief counseling. It's okay to do those things. And, you know, if you don't really like the formal kind of, you know, help, you can go to informal kind of help by joining support groups like PFA, and I'll drop the link for them in the chat too. And, you know, I always tell everybody, I'm like, we suffer in isolation, but we heal in community. And that's where you need to seek that healing, is through community. And that's kind of what we are here too, through advocacy groups and, you know, local organizations and, you know, even national organizations. And, you know, just recognizing the impact of trauma, not only on yourself, but on your family or the families who are affected, and finding a way to memorialize your deceased loved one, you know, can really be a healing aspect. And can you go to the next slide for me, please? Thank you. And, you know, doing any kind of advocacy work, and even, you know, dealing with your own self-care, you know, things can be overwhelming and emotional and super stressful. And so there's so many techniques out there that can help ground yourself. And one of them is actually this one here, the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. And that's naming 5 things you can see, 4 you can feel, 3 that you can hear, 2 to smell, and 1 thing that you can taste. And we definitely will be sharing these out. So I just recommend just looking into anything. There's breathing techniques, there's, you know, meditation, there's so much to help refocus and calm oneself. And if you can go to the next slide, please. And again, these are just some tips and resources for death in custody. And I will make sure to drop the information in the chat for you guys. And also, please remember that there are support groups out there like PFA that are very, very helpful and very supportive. And, you know, there's, you know, other things too. And make sure, I just want to point this out, that when you're talking with the news or the radio stations or any kind of new, media, right, make sure to let them know that this was a person who was in custody. This was a person who was, you know, incarcerated at this time. It's very crucial to put that out there, to emphasize that, to let people know that, you know, this is happening. This is really happening, because a lot of times people don't know what is going on inside unless we talk about it. So thank you. I appreciate it. And I'm going to turn it back over to Dr. Avon. You're muted.
I know. Let me take a look at everyone. I was doing several things at the same time because I've got about 3 monitors here. The last question that I have on the screen, it's actually a question and also a 2023 focus on our upcoming initiatives. And I want to turn it over to you as advocates, as heads of nonprofit organizations, those of you who are attorneys, those of you who are, you know, fighting battles from a singular perspective. What should be the 2023 focus for advocacy? And as you think about that and you share by coming off mute or entering it into the chat, I'd ask you to think about what you heard in terms of the video. and just let us know, are there any topics that you'd like for us to cover? Is there anything that you'd like for us to delve into in terms of having a specific and targeted focus, but also coming up with a set of actionable steps? And also remembering that everything we do in this space requires an element of self-care. And in fact, each of us who engage in this conference will have to make sure that we, engage in some level of self-care, because there are some things that we will hear that may take us back or remind us of personal experiences or the experiences of others who we have supported. And I'll talk a little bit about that on Friday, but I invite you to come off mute and give me your big ticket items for 2023. Anyone? Otherwise, I'll start calling on people.
I'll jump in. I think one thing that we can do collectively, since we work in so many different organizations across the country, is how can we come together to encourage the United States to enforce human rights principles? Because human rights treaty bodies and human rights principles are binding. Now, maybe the Mandela Rules, as she said, may not be something you can sue for, but there are treaty bodies, human rights treaty bodies, as it pertains to the rights of incarcerated individuals under international human rights law. How can we articulate that even more so for the United States so that we can stop, being number one? That's not something we should be proud of, being number one in the mass incarceration. So how do we break that mold of being number one in the country, in the world?
Thank you. I've noted that. Next, we've got Tiffany Green.
Hey, so just piggyback off of Dr. Tate's comments, and I had dropped a comment in the chat as you were talking about it. It was a little late, but I think what really made an impression on me with Mr. Cadoni's presentation was how much they were able to accomplish in the country by unifying all of these groups and organizations that had a common thread, that had a common goal, and how little he sees that in the United States. And granted, we're a much larger country, but he was a little dumbfounded about, why aren't you guys doing that? Because one of the questions that we had for him was, well, how are you able to get the attention of the United Nations and bring this to such a large organization? And that was his answer. We reached out and we linked arms with all of these other groups, special interest groups and organizations who were on the same page as we were. So I would really love to see movement in that direction to try to unify and be aware of all these other groups and projects and people and agencies and organizations who are moving in the same direction and being in communication with them. And this conference is a huge step, to be able to do that, as our other conferences. But what other conferences are happening in the country? What other things are happening that we can all be aware of and reach out and again, link arms to try to provide more of a united front to, again, enforce those human rights and those initiatives at the federal level.
Yeah, thank you for that, Tiffany. And it reminds me of, my initial, request saying, let's come together, and tackle that death in custody, or last phone calls. That's just the human aspect of it. Like Dr. Tate said, we can raise our voices as a collective and we can figure out how to do it. So let's make some noise and let's get some things done. Jim and then Jess.
I think, with the fact that there's so much mental health issues, PTSD, and our prisons are our largest mental hospitals sometimes. I think we need to have a much higher quality of mental health care within our prisons. And because of the toxic environment, I think a lot of that needs to take place outside of prison fences, where people will feel more, sorry for the phone, will feel more able to trust. And that would also allow us to involve family members since they're outside the prison system. So that would be a big take. And the other is just making sure that we have outside groups that are able to look at what's going on in our prisons.
Thank you,
Sorry for the
Jim.
phone, by the way.
Thank you, Jim. Okay, Jess?
Yes, just for time's sake, I will be quick. Jim kind of said it, and I did drop it in the chat. Our carceral system is the largest ICU for mental health challenges, right? This really needs to change. And I think it all really starts with, trauma-informed care. Getting the judges trauma, trained. And it's not just about trauma informed, it's trauma aware and trauma responsive, right? And so I think that's really, really critical for like across the whole justice system is everybody needs to be trained on trauma and how to be responsive to it. And, I think that would change, and better training for the CEOs, get them some trauma informed care training. And, I really feel that's not really put into their training as a CEO, and breaking that us versus them mentality can really, really change how the culture inside is.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you have the last word, Jess. In closing, first of all,
Yes.
thank you, co-presenters. You guys did a fantastic job. Kudos. Thank you so much for highlighting those issues and giving us a platform for discussion. It is important that we raise our voices, whether it's through written form, whether it's verbal or otherwise, because within the context of silence is oppression, right? And so your voices actually matter. The work that you do, the singular efforts that you do, your organizations provide tremendous support. Keep doing what you're doing and join us and lend your expertise as we mobilize in 2023 to try to address some of these big ticket items. Jess will drop my contact information in the chat. Get in touch with me, get in touch with info at Prisoner Family Conference. If you would like to just simply lend your voice or say, these are the priority issues for 2023. We take a break after the conference, but we gear up and mobilize in January. Get your thoughts together, send us your ideas, and please join us, give us feedback,